Welcome, everyone. My name is Christina Kepi, and I'm the Director of the Center for Canadian American Studies. Thank you so much for joining us today. I would like to begin by acknowledging that Western Washington University's main campus is situated on the ancestral homelands of the Coast Salish peoples who have lived in the Salish Sea Basin all throughout the San Juan Islands of the North Cascades watershed from time immemorial. We express our deepest respect and gratitude to our Indigenous neighbors for their enduring care and protection of our shared lands and waterways. The Center for Canadian American Studies and Western's Alumni Association, we're excited to welcome you today to our sixth webinar of our speaker series called Western Leads Canada. That's a course that we gave called Why Canada Matters. Today's webinar is called The Persistence of Western Alienation in Canada, and our featured speaker is Professor Loleen Berdahl. Professor Berdahl is an award-winning university instructor. She is the executive director of the Johnson Shoyama Graduate School of Public Policy at universities of Saskatchewan and Regina. And she is professor and former head of political studies at the University of Saskatchewan. Her research focuses on Canadian federalism with particular emphasis on Western Canada. Professor Berdahl is also the author of the Academia Made Easier newsletter, which provides easy tips for teaching, productivity, and work-life balance in academia. She lives in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, with her husband, twin teenage daughters, and 2 cats, which is very important to add. I miss my cat right now. I'm not at home or not in town at the moment, and I miss my cat. In today's talk, Dr. Berdahl considers the persistence of regional conflict in Canada by examining Western alienation. That is, discontent emerging from one, some, or all of Canada's 4 westernmost provinces: British Columbia, Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba. Her argument is that Canada's national unity challenges reactions to the centering of one of Canada's many possible narratives as the dominant national narrative, creating tension with other alternative perspectives. She further argues that the study of Western alienation allows us to delve into the structural features of Canadian federalism that exacerbate rather than moderate endemic regional conflict in our vast and diverse country. We're very excited to have her with us today, and she is also a speaker in our CanAm 406 Canadian Government and Politics class. So hello, students. It's wonderful to see you. And as I mentioned, she is our final speaker in our new speaker series called Why Canada Matters. And this speaker series is brought to you by the generous support from the College of Humanities and Social Sciences and the Department of History, and of course, in partnership with the Western Alumni Office. For those of you who are joining us online today, we're thrilled to have you with us, and you can submit questions through the Q&A feature at the bottom middle of your screen. Some of you have already submitted some questions, which we will get to during the Q&A time, but we will be looking for questions from the class first and foremost, but we will get to some questions that are being submitted online. So please do use the Q&A function. So let's get started. And without any further ado, I bring you Dr. Loleen Berdahl.
Excellent. Well, hello, everyone, and thank you so much for having me here. It's a real pleasure to be with you. So I received this invitation in part because of my connection with Dr. Kamina, who, as I know him, Butch, who I did my doctoral studies with at the University of Calgary, and I have such fond memories of basically hanging out and studying with Butch. I spent a lot of time with him and his amazing wife Christy, and it was it's those as time goes on, those memories are much more cherished. So thank you very much, Butch, for inviting me into your class, and students in his class. You are very lucky to have such an amazing instructor. I also want to start by acknowledging that I am speaking to you today from Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, which is based in Treaty 6 territory in the traditional homeland of the Métis here in Saskatchewan. And this is a very important thing for me personally to acknowledge. I lead a public policy school, and the history of Canadian public policy towards Canada's First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people is fraught and troubled. And so acknowledging that history and the importance of that relationship and the importance of reconciliation to the future of Canada is very important to me personally, and it impacts the work I do on a day-to-day basis. So I'm going to, and then one last thing before I actually share my screen here is Christina kindly mentioned that I live with 2 cats. So I'm actually joining you from my home office today, despite my background here. I'm actually at home. So if you suddenly see a tail across the screen, it's because we've been joined by a feline friend. So with that, I am going to share my screen and slides and get us started here. Slideshow, play from the start. So you'll notice I tweaked the title of the presentation here because things are happening and are afoot in Western Canada right now, and I want to sort of start with the present, and then go back a bit, and then you'll see I'm still going to talk about the persistence of Western alienation, but I'm going to talk about it in terms of some live events that are happening right now, and then connect them up for everybody. So the new title I've got here is Standing Up to Ottawa, and how Alberta and Saskatchewan are challenging the Canadian Federation and why it matters. And I think this sort of connects with the title of this entire speaker theme of why Canada matters. And I would like to acknowledge that I'm working on a project with my colleague, Dr. Lisa Young at the University of Calgary, and that this work represents collective work that we're doing. So I don't want to take full credit for all of it. Sorry, it's my slides are not allowing me to advance here. So there we go. So in November, which seems both a long time ago because winters on the Canadian prairie feel very long, but it was actually less than half a year ago, or roughly half a year ago. There were 2 very important developments that happened in Alberta and Saskatchewan. The Saskatchewan First Act was right at the start of November. The Alberta Sovereignty Within United Canada Act was passed at the end of November. And just sort of briefly, I won't go through it in too much depth, but the Saskatchewan First Act restates that Saskatchewan has constitutional jurisdiction over its natural resources, and is basically stating that, or claiming that the federal government cannot pass laws interfering with its authority over natural resources. And it amends the provincial constitution to say that Saskatchewan is and always has been dependent on agricultural and natural resources and so on, and that its ability to control the development of its non-renewable natural resources is critical to the future well-being and prosperity of Saskatchewan and its people. So it's really putting forward a strong stance, saying that that we have these rights, we have these constitutional rights to natural resources and our economy and our future. At the same time, or not at the same time, it was but roughly 4 weeks later, the Alberta government passed the Alberta Sovereignty Within a United Canada Act, and this gave the provincial legislature authority to, quote, offer an opinion, I love that language, that a federal law or initiative is unconstitutional and harmful. And then if it concludes that federal law is unconstitutional and harmful to the province, then it authorizes the province to take action, such as not enforcing the law. So basically saying, oh, well, thank you, and no. And what's important about that is provincial entities, including police forces, municipalities, post-secondary institutions, etc., would have to follow any directive from the provincial government. So really sort of strong statements from both these 2 provinces. But just like with the ShamWow commercials, that's not all. So wait, there's more in both provinces. So in Saskatchewan, saw emphasis on provincial marshal services, Alberta Provincial Police Force, for some of you who are like, well, what's this about? Right now in certain Canadian provinces, rather than having provincial police forces, instead the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, or RCMP, are the police forces used. In Saskatchewan, a framework for a provincial revenue agency, and basically the same thing in Alberta, collecting provincial taxes, and then in Alberta creating a provincial pension plan to replace the CCP. I said this is all very live stuff. Just yesterday, the Saskatchewan government passed legislation to move forward with potentially setting up a provincial revenue agency. This is important because even though we don't see that third bullet there about a provincial pension plan, in order for a province to set up a provincial pension plan, it has to first have a provincial revenue agency. So we're seeing sort of a very similar trajectory here. So the argument I'm going to be putting forward to you in the next little bit is that Western alienation is currently challenging Confederation, so the Canadian Union, in a new way, and that this challenge has implications for all of Canada. And so I'm going to be teasing this out for you as I proceed forward. But first, I just want to make sure everybody, when you talk about anything to do with political science, I always like to start by defining our terms. So what on earth do I mean by Western alienation, for those of you who aren't familiar with this? Western alienation is a long-standing, regionally concentrated, and widespread feeling of discontent with the provincial position of whichever province is experiencing it at the time within Canadian federalism. And so it varies in intensity over time, and I'll talk to that briefly. But it's something that sort of goes up and down. I'd say right now it's a bit up. But what's interesting is I say it's regionally concentrated. It almost always includes Saskatchewan and Alberta. So if you see in my circle there, that's the nice and neat my province, the province that looks like it's an iron, and the province right to the west of it, that's Alberta and Saskatchewan. It sometimes includes BC, which of course is right above Washington, and Manitoba, which is on the eastern side of what's commonly referred to as Western Canada. So Western alienation is a long-standing part of Canadian political culture. So I have a number of examples here of different political cartoons because I find editorial cartoons to be very illustrative of basicin a sense of politics. And sort of that's one of the, I think, a point of loss that we're going to have in how we've moved away from newspapers over time is that we're going to be losing, or we are losing editorial cartoons and their importance. But you can see here in the years that I'm showing, 1880. So we didn't even have the provinces of Alberta and Saskatchewan. They were still territories. BC was sort of new. Manitoba was a nub. And then we've got into 1916, 1931, 1979. So it's long-standing. So we're not talking about, oh, well, this is something that is recent. This goes back to before certain provinces were even provinces. And it's really long-standing perceptions of economic and political unfairness and exploitation. So here's some other examples of some cartoons and a bumper sticker. So the cartoon on the very top left is from 1912, and it shows basically the bunch of sort of well-fed men smoking cigars out in what we out here would call Eastern Canada, but really what we're talking about is mainly Ontario and Quebec, and they're having a feast on the 1912 crop, and then it shows in a little circle the actual man who raised the turkey starving. We've got an example of discussions about Senate reform, and they talk about a triple E Senate. Everything Ontario wants it gets, everything Quebec wants it gets, and everyone else gets what's left over. So we've got this sort of sense of exploitation. And perhaps one of the more famous bumper stickers in Canadian history, which comes from a period of tension over oil and gas revenues and supplies in Canada. And this was a bumper sticker that we saw in the province of Alberta primarily. And that was, "Let the Eastern bastards freeze in the dark. We're just going to cut off their supply of energy resources from Western Canada in response." So this is sort of the sentiment that comes and goes. Now, what often is thought and misunderstood about Western alienation is there can be this argument, and it's usually a very contemporary argument that's not informed by the history of this phenomena, is that this is very partisan or based on personalities. So we currently have a Prime Minister Trudeau. We in the past had a previous Prime Minister Trudeau, which was so current Prime Minister is Justin Trudeau. His father was Pierre Elliott Trudeau. I think it's fair to say that neither Trudeau has been tremendously popular in Western Canada. The Liberal Party, which both Prime Ministers Trudeau as well as a number of other prime ministers has not always been very popular in Western Canada. So it can be very tempting to say, oh, well, this is a Liberal issue, or this is a partisan issue, or this is based on people in Western Canada just not liking the Trudeaus or just not liking these particular individuals. But the reality is that the history of these tensions goes beyond partisanship. It goes beyond individuals. So there's great examples of Western alienation popping up under conservative governments, under conservative leaders, under individuals who you would think would have more resonance with Western Canadians. And so the point here is that this is a long-standing matter that is very deeply rooted. It's very, very, very deeply held within Western Canada. Paul Martin, I like to reference Paul Martin because he was a prime minister. He was prime minister in 2003, not just that year, but this quote from him was then. So he was Liberal prime minister. He came in after Prime Minister Jean Chrétien. In the period of Jean Chrétien's leadership, Western alienation was rather high. And so when Paul Martin became prime minister, he said he was going to deal with Western alienation. He was going to fix this problem, and he did make a number of efforts. So he has this his quote from 2003 where he said, "No matter what I do as prime minister, if Western alienation is the same at the end of my term as it is now, I will not believe I will have succeeded." And so that was his feeling. Well, he tried, and then his thoughts did change after some effort. And so here's a sort of this was an interview with a journalist, and I think sort of speaks to sort of the challenges that Martin had. So the journalist writes, Martin has come to feel that Western alienation is something that ebbs and flows, that may also be a permanent part of the Canadian condition. So this really speaks to the persistence and resilience of Western alienation in Canada, and how it's sort of some ways a really challenging issue for federal leaders. It can also be a really effective tool for provincial leaders. So what's going on? Why does this continue to happen? And the answer is that it has multiple causes. It has multiple dimensions. They reinforce, and there's different things that can come into play. One dimension is the history of Western Canada and how it emerged in Canada. So Canada, for those of you who aren't aware, who want a little bit of a refresher, when Canada was originally founded, it was founded with 4 colonies, essentially, that became provinces, and then other provinces were added in or created out of territories. And so there was sort of so none of the Western provinces were part of the original creation of Canada. They were added in different ways, and they were added in particular with the prairie provinces with different rights, particularly over natural resources. So while other provinces had control over their natural resources from the start, that was not the case for Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba. And so, they were sort of started off with some unequal footing on that front. There was also in Alberta and Saskatchewan were created out of the Northwest Territories, and at the time of a lot of the settlement of the prairies, Saskatchewan at one point was the 3rd largest province in Canada, which seems hard to believe right now. But it was a really kind of a boom era for it. But when the 2 provinces were created in 1905, there had been one argument that they should be a single province called Buffalo, and that this was decided against. And one of the reasons that has been identified for why 2 provinces were created was a desire to not have the prairies be too dominant. And so there's sort of that feeling of inequity and desire to not have the prairies be too large that sort of fosters this culture of alienation. Economics, there's been, as you saw from the images I showed of the Easterners eating the turkey from the West. There's other examples of that kind of sentiment, a sense of exploitation. And there's a number of policies that I will not bore you with, having to do with freight rates for the National Railroad and the selling of grain and all these sorts of things that were really seen to not be at the benefit of Western Canada, and particularly the prairie provinces, that sort of come into play, and a feeling of threat that the other parts of Canada, particularly central Canada, are going to exploit what's going well in the Western provinces, and particularly prairie provinces. In terms of politics, there are there's been research that's been done that sort of demonstrates this. There's some unique prairie political values. So the prairie provinces were settled in a different way than other parts of Canada. There was definite efforts to settle the prairie provinces with populations being brought in from different parts of Eastern Europe, as opposed to France and England. There was a larger American population settlement, particularly in Alberta, than in other parts of Canada. So there were different cultural influences that came into play in the settlement of Western Canada, and particularly of the prairie provinces, that led to different values, much more populist values, sort of in some ways more individualist and more collectivist values, sort of a pragmatism. We see in Canadian political history that a lot of the protest parties, third parties that have emerged in Canadian political history have come out of the prairie provinces. So we see that. Identity is another dimension that plays into Western alienation. So in addition to people identifying with Canada, we have people identifying with their provinces, and we also have people identifying with Western Canada as a region. And so these sort of competing forms of identity come into play. And the final thing that I think is important to note is that settler colonialism is a dimension of Western alienation. And so there's a real sense of entitlement to occupy and to exploit natural resources. And this comes from a sort of a complex history of how the prairie provinces were literally settled, and people brought in and given land quite often, and it's quite fascinating. If for those of you with who enjoy history, you can see these old advertisements inviting settlers to come to from Europe to Western Canada. It shows images of Saskatchewan, and then you can see the mountains in the background. And for any of you who have ever been to Saskatchewan, to see the mountains, you would I don't know, it's a good I'm trying to think, about a 9-hour drive or maybe even more, but perhaps if you've got sort of very, very special vision, you could make it work. I'm not sure, but very misleading advertising. But this sense that this land is here for us to occupy, exploit, very natural resource-based economies. So all of these things really intersect, reinforce, and play off each other. And so for anyone trying to deal with Western alienation, there's so much going on that it would be sort of a little bit of a sense of I don't know if any of you are aware of this game. I think it exists beyond Canada, but the idea of whack-a-mole, where you deal with one thing and then another part pops up and another part pops up, and they're all continuing to go on together. So my argument that I stated at the front, and I'll sort of tease this out for you, is that Western alienation is currently challenging Confederation in a new way. So it's long-standing, but there's some new stuff here that I think is really interesting to pay attention to. And the argument as well is that this matters for all of Canada. And so I'm going to explain first of all, what's new, and then why it matters. So what's new with the new efforts by Saskatchewan and Alberta is that they're taking a double-barreled strategy that's a bit unique and a bit more constitutional. And so the double-barreled strategy is first based on confrontation. And so it's very assertive. It's very sort of in the face of the federal government, not reactive, but more sort of trying to really construct a powerful stance. And looking at expanding provincial authority over natural resources and really narrowing federal authority, particularly when it comes to address climate change. And this is important, and it's something that I'll come back to very shortly. The second thing is fortification. So the idea here is to really build and strengthen the provincial state and to weaken the national state. And so the idea is to make a more complete provincial political world within provincial boundaries, to not need or be engaged as much with the federal government. And so these are two very sort of complementary and reinforcing dimensions that we're seeing with this strategy. So why are we seeing this happen? And so I'm going to point to 3 reasons why I and my colleague, Dr. Lisa Young, believe that this is going on right now. The first is existential angst. And so we have a shift in that there's always been a sense of economic threat in Western alienation. But it's gone a little further at this point to what we consider to be more of an existential anxiety because of the fact that sorry, I'm not going to say Western Canada anymore. I'm going to say Alberta and Saskatchewan's economies are so entwined with natural resources, so entwined with industry that really has a very large climate change footprint. So and here what we have is we have the economic side of Western alienation and the identity side of Western alienation interacting. So people in Western Canada, people in Alberta and Saskatchewan identify as working in, being involved in, connecting with natural resource industries. We've got this real connection with agriculture, with oil and gas, with forestry, with potash, with uranium, critical minerals, all of these things. And there's a fear that not only is it an economic threat in the way of, oh, well, they're going to take our money and give it to Quebec or, give it to other parts of Canada, but rather that a way of life is ending, that the survival of these industries, the survival of the prairies as we know it right now, and as they've been or believed to have been in the past, is under threat and like an existential maybe ending. And so this is a really deeply felt sentiment that we're seeing emerging right now. And it really connects to broader conversations about climate change and questions of how we're dealing with greenhouse gas emissions. And so this is something that is a real challenge and a real point of contention in these two provinces in particular. And to put some picture on this, if you look at this image here shows greenhouse gas emissions by province and territory over time. What we see is Alberta and Saskatchewan, but also BC and Manitoba are important emitters of greenhouse gas emissions. And so climate mitigation strategies, of course, are going to hit these provinces. Now, you might be looking at this and saying, well, but Ontario and Quebec are more. Well, yes. And what you're not seeing in this image is a per capita look at this. So Ontario alone is over 40% of the Canadian population. Quebec and Ontario together are the majority of the population. And so what we're seeing is that we have strong emissions from Alberta in particular due to oil and gas production, but also due to in Saskatchewan and Manitoba and BC due to their industries that are well above their per capita levels. And so this is sort of a point of concern, is how climate mitigation strategies, how a green economy are going to affect these provinces in particular. And what we have is we have people living in these provinces who are frankly stressed about this. So these are some survey data that we collected in 2021, so about 2 years ago. Not about, it was 2 years ago, pardon me. And what we see is if we look at emotions, and emotions matter greatly to politics, and what we see is that in Alberta in particular, people are frightened, they're angry, they're pessimistic about the future of their province in Canada. And even though people in Saskatchewan are less dour on this front, we still see a third of the population roughly who feel quite negatively about the future of their province in Canada. So this is important in terms of understanding where these sentiments of Western alienation are coming from. My province's best days are behind it. We see in Alberta that we've got a lot of people feeling that things don't look good for the future. In Alberta and Saskatchewan, a bit more neutrality, but still not a lot of. I'd put this as a fair bit of concern at the very least. Second dimension is political polarization. So we see polarization in federal politics, and I'll speak about that a little bit, but also polarization in provincial politics. In Alberta, back when Butch and I both lived there, Alberta was basically a one-party state. Wasn't basically, it was. It's not that anymore. So there's a lot more political contestation going on. Saskatchewan used to be more of a two-party system. It's moved to a one-party system, but there's still a lot of threat in provincial politics that the governing Saskatchewan party needs to be aware of. At the federal level, we are also seeing a fair bit of polarization that does go back to some of that long-standing liberal Trudeau dimension that I mentioned earlier. So, and I apologize if this is hard to see, but this is approval of Prime Minister Justin Trudeau by province over time. And what we see is if you look at the bottom two lines in this, that's Alberta and Saskatchewan. So when I say he's not popular, he's really not popular in these two provinces. For anyone who is driving around in Alberta or Saskatchewan, it's hard to make a trip anywhere without seeing a vehicle that has on it some kind of bumper sticker or decal, what do they call it, detailing or whatever it is, that say things like F Trudeau. Doesn't say F. It sometimes has images of what people feel should be done to Mr. Trudeau, Prime Minister Trudeau. Someone told me recently that they were at a rural Saskatchewan. It was an anniversary party for someone celebrating their 30th or 50th anniversary, something like that, and people got into loud arguments about Prime Minister Trudeau, and so this is visceral politics that we see happening here, and so what we see here is these sort of long-standing feelings of Western alienation still being in place. So again, this is 2 years ago. I suspect the numbers are possibly a bit higher, but if you look at the results here, I'll just pull a few of these as an example. My province is not treated with the respect it deserves in Canada. 67% of Albertans and 70% of Saskatchewanians agree. No matter who's in charge in Ottawa, other parts of Canada will always be looked after before my province. 59% of Albertans and 58% of Saskatchewanians agree. So we've got this sort of feeling of exploitation and unhappiness at a political level. Finally, I think an important thing to note is the dimension of settler colonialism. And so there used to be sort of a settler colonial consensus. Yeah, of course it's our right to exploit land. That's what we do. That's what we're here for. And we're seeing more internal challenges to this. We're seeing a big shift in Canadian political discourse, as well as provincial political discourse, about a recognition of what the colonial project has meant in Canada and its harmful effects. And so we're seeing a lot of challenges much needed challenges to this settler colonial assumption. The Indigenous population is growing in Canada, is particularly growing in Saskatchewan, as well as in Alberta, but particularly in Saskatchewan. And Indigenous communities are contesting the claims of the rights of provinces and the federal government as well, to just have an assumption that they can develop and exploit the land. So both the Saskatchewan First Act and the Alberta Act, with the long name that I'm not going to ramble off for you right now, both of those acts have been critiqued and challenged by First Nations and Métis communities, saying, yeah, you didn't consult us. How is this legitimate? We also, with particularly urban communities, particularly with new Canadian communities that don't sort of buy into this settler colonial narrative, we're seeing more challenges on that front. And so this is something that then sort of feeds back into this angst and identity and history and politics. So it's all sort of reinforcing in these interesting ways. So what does this mean for Canada? So to go back to that fortification strategy that I mentioned, so if Alberta and Saskatchewan withdraw from national programs and national institutions, such as the Canadian Pension Plan, such as tax collection, such as the RCMP, then this is going to weaken national institutions. And so it's going to create more decentralization and more asymmetry in Canada as a federation. And Canada is already one of the most decentralized federations in the world, and this will reinforce it. It also becomes a bit self-reinforcing. So as the provinces become stronger, it makes it easier for the provinces to become stronger. And so as the provincial state grows and becomes more robust, it becomes easier for them to distance, and also to float ideas of, well, why do we need Canada? Maybe we could do it on our own. And so we see these narratives emerging more and more. On the confrontation side, we see that we're going to see a lot of legal challenges. And we are already seeing legal challenges specifically on the area of energy and climate change. And so we're going to have a real challenge in terms of having either federal, provincial, intergovernmental cooperation and harmony, or addressing issues of greenhouse gas emissions and climate change. But how to balance the two is a really tricky and challenging issue that is hard to sort out. All of this really it speaks as well to dimensions of Canada and its long-standing existential angst and vulnerability. So in its very history, Canada emerged as a survival story. There were threats. The U.S. You guys were just coming off of civil war and there was a lot of concern about American invasion. There were economic threats. The agreements with our motherland, Britain, economic protection from Britain was diminishing, and so there was a lot of concern about what was going to happen to the colonies, and that's how Canada originally came together. Was more about surviving than anything else. Of course, in French Canada, there's concern about survival of the French language and French culture, and of what that means in Canada. There's been long-standing efforts in Canada for nation building to deal with these issues of survival, and increasingly since, I'd say, the 1960s, due to some very, very horrible policies that were put in place, there's been a lot of concerns about about First Nations, Métis, and Inuit cultural survival, and so there's that sort of very difficult history. And so the sense of vulnerability and survival is part of a Canadian story, and so we're seeing this play out a bit on the prairies. And so what my colleague Dr. Lisa Young and I argue is that the greenhouse gas conflict could create a bit of a survival crisis for Canada with respect to Alberta and Saskatchewan. And so there's a coming fight. There's a very large fight coming up with respect to greenhouse gas emissions, and this is going to be a challenge. So the provinces, Alberta and Saskatchewan, are trying to get establish themselves as having a veto, and there's the risk that the federal government, if it says yeah, no, and sort of acts unilaterally, this could trigger a wave of separatism. And so that was my argument. I'm just going to throw it out with some questions for all of you. It doesn't mean that you have to answer them, but I wouldn't mind if you at least took them away as reflection questions, and then I'll go to your own questions. And that is whether or not there's an American comparison for Western alienation. Is there anything like this in the US, or is this just a Canadian thing? I'd also be curious to know your thoughts in terms of, well, what would the US federal government do if Western alienation existed there? Sort of the history of Civil War gives one clue what some of this might play out as, but I'd just be curious in a modern sense what people think on that front. And then the last thing is, what might Western alienation demonstrate or suggest about the differences between Canada and the US? So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I will see if we have any questions. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Berdahl. That was wonderful and very, very informative. I certainly learned a lot, even though I did spend 6 years living in Alberta. So thank you. We have time for some questions. I'm going to pass it over to Lisa there in the classroom to see if we have any questions coming in from students. And I think we do. Yeah. So we have someone walking around. Okay.
Let us know, otherwise we'll do some microphone shenanigans.
Okay. Can kind of hear you, but we'll need it louder.
Can they hear me? Hello?
I can hear you.
So how would Alberta go about getting the RCMP out of Alberta if they want to look at federal policing? We were in Parliament in Victoria, they're having a conversation, I think, about in Surrey about having a local police force there. Does the federal government push back against these police forces there, or how does that go?
I'm going to repeat what I thought I heard the question to be, and then make sure that I got that. So the question was, well, what would the federal response be to basically disengagement with the RCMP? Is that the question?
Yeah, that was a question.
Great. So so there are provinces in Canada that do have provincial police forces. So Ontario and Quebec have their own provincial police forces. The way the relationship works with the RCMP is provinces enter into longer, basically, I think it's 10-year agreements, contracting agreements with the RCMP. And so there's basically the opportunity on a regular basis for a province to not renew and opt out. And so the federal government really wouldn't have much much ability to stop it. The RCMP have had a number of challenges recently, some under-resourcing, and particularly like I'm wanting to try to put it into context because it's challenging for people who aren't familiar. So Alberta and Saskatchewan and actually Canada as a whole is a very large land mass. Most of it very rural and very unpopulated. And so, for RCMP to cover these large areas of land can be really challenging. And the relationship with the RCMP with local communities can sometimes be a bit fraught. And so yeah, there's sort of an ongoing tension on that front. I feel like there was a second part to that question though that I missed. Was there?
I was just wondering, like, how do they go about pushing the RCMP out of the provincial, like, out of the province? Like, how would Alberta go about getting rid of RCMP, like, just a contract? They just leave?
Yeah. So basically, they would need to have a solid alternative in place, and like you need something there before you end the contract. But yes, they could choose to. My understanding is they could just choose to not renew the contract. So they need some kind of transition. They need to develop a sufficient police force to essentially take over. Thanks. That's a great question.
Thank you so much. We're going to pass to a question that has come in over the chat. And it starts with a little statement, and then the question follows. And the comment is, the American experience seems entirely similar with alienation of the Western US states from the dominant Eastern states early on, and now with the populous and politically dominant East and West coastal states. Does the American experience inform your thinking and analysis of how Canada might cope with alienation of Western provinces?
That's a great question. And the answer is yes, no, and kind of. And so I think so. Yes, in that some of the work that we've looked at. Is anyone here familiar with the idea of Cascadia? I see some nodding in the room. And so, there's some of that movement. There's a group called PNWAR, the Pacific Northwest Economic Region, sort of economic collaboration between Saskatchewan, Alberta, BC, Washington, and Oregon. I'm trying to think if I can't remember if there's some more states involved. And so sort of looking at that a little bit, and at the same time, I think I would be happy to have the American experience inform our work better. So whoever sent that question in, if you have some ideas on the front and want to email me, I would love to hear. I would love to hear any insights that you might have. So the answer is yes, a little bit, but I would love to learn more about the American experience as well.
Are there any other questions from the class? Oh, I see Butch has one. Yeah.
Kind of remarked at the beginning, 3 great years of made people and 30 years since. So my question, you talked about the consensus, the colonial consensus eroding a little bit.
Yeah.
So there is a provincial election coming in Alberta. How much does all of this inform that election? Or does it end up being more about short-term things of partisan advantage and disadvantage? Or do you think these issues do actually get talked about in this provincial election, and how much of the result have an impact on it?
Well, that's a fantastic question. So the Alberta election is fascinating. So there's a number. It's been interesting. So Premier Smith in obtaining her position as party leader, really campaigned hard within her party on the Alberta Sovereignty Act, and sort of a strong position against the federal government. And then as the campaign has gone on, they've actually kind of really been downplaying that act and trying to create some distance from it, which is interesting. I'm not sure how aware people are, but right now, as the election is ongoing, there's a number of really terrible and deadly forest fires that are ongoing in Alberta, and so Premier Smith has had to reach out and get the support and assistance of the federal government, which of course is a challenging position with her. She's taken a very strong stance of anti-federal government, and I'm sure that was a hard conversation for her to have. So these things kind of all play out in interesting ways. The Alberta election is going to be decided on the city of Calgary, and how Calgary is going to go, and what will push the needle in Calgary is unclear. So my sense is that the economic and identity dimensions are going to ultimately be dominant, Butch, but I'm always hesitant in any political thing, in that every time I'm absolutely sure about something, then something interesting will happen partway through the campaign. And so, but right now, I think that the narrative of pushing back against the federal government it's always a winner. It's a like, how when you go and you see a band play live, and then they've got the hit songs that everyone will jump to their feet and dance along with. Well, attacking the federal government is that song in the prairie provinces, and the fact that the forest fires are going on, and that she's having to rely on the federal government to get through this crisis, sort of doesn't allow her to play that song at the same volume. That's the most tortured analogy I've done in ages. I apologize to all of you. Oh my goodness. Forget that analogy. That's
I rather like that one. That was awesome.
okay.
Dr. Berdahl, there is one more. Do you have 2 minutes?
I'm in no rush. Go ahead.
Okay. Thank you. This one is actually from one of us professors, and it is read as follows. The federal government has tended to respond to these sorts of regional demands by agreeing to further decentralization of powers, provinces, most notably Quebec. How far can this process go before the unity of Canada as a single country is undermined?
That is a fantastic question. I want to answer the question by saying, yeah. And that's not an answer at all, but it's sort of that existential question that we've been constantly dealing with. And it's an increasingly dangerous question, I think, in that, like what the example that Lisa and I often like to use is Brexit. And so the UK Prime Minister at the time, when he said, "Yeah, I'll put to a referendum," didn't expect it to go the way it was going to go. And there's always a risk that some premier is going to be like, "Yeah, I can roll the dice on this. It'll get me some votes. I don't have to really worry about it." And then you end up with some kind of strange movement that people don't see coming, that could put Canada in a very, very tenuous position. And so when I think about, sort of how decentralized can this country get? To what extent do we cease being a country and instead of being a federation, we're more of a confederal system? It's a real challenge. And the mention of Quebec as well. I will note that in the history of Western alienation, for a long time, it was sort of based on sort of jealousy of Quebec, a resentment of Quebec, arguing, Quebec is a problem and they need to be more like us. That's really shifted in the last decade, I would say. And the narrative instead has been, hey, it works for Quebec, we can make it work for us. And so then it sort of becomes, well, then, if Quebec becomes, if Quebec's a bit of an unusual case, and then Alberta and Saskatchewan become an unusual case, then we've got 3 out of 10 provinces being unusual cases. BC's always, and I say this with love, I have family in BC's always unusual, so it's going to become its own unusual case. And you just kind of, and at a certain point, it's like, well, what are we as a country? And so that's a great question. I don't know if I've given a satisfactory answer, other than sort of saying, that there are definite unity issues that are at play here.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Kind of wish we had more time to continue because there were some questions that were starting to come in that were of really some nice reflective nature. But that is for another time, I guess. Dr. Loleen Berdahl, thank you so much for joining us today and for closing out our Why Canada Matters speaker series for this year. It's been a great success. Thank you to everyone who has joined us today and to our partners, the Alumni Association, and to our sponsors and to the students in Butch's class. Thank you so much. And those who have joined us, you should receive an email here shortly in the next few days with a link to the recording of this lovely discussion. Okay, so without further ado, I'll let you get back to the rest of your day. Thank you so much. It's been wonderful. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone. Visit Canada.
Bye-bye.